Chapter 1. The Ruler. A corpse, the corpse of labor. All power formed an alliance to defend its rule, the World Bank, Tony and Jörg Haider, trades and entrepreneurs, ecologists and French socialists. They don't slogan, jobs, jobs, jobs. Not forgotten what reflection is all about, will easilize the implausibility of such an attitude. This by labor does not experience any temporary crisis, it inks its absolute limit. In the way electronic revolution, production increasingly became independent from the actual expenditure of human labor power to an extent quite recently only imaginable in science fiction. No one maintain any longer that this process can be halted or reversed. Selling labor power in the 21st century is as promising as the sale of stagecoaches has proved to be in the 20th century. However, whoever able to sell his or her labor power in this society is considered to be superfluous and will be disposed of on the social waste dump. The work, labor, shout. This sin is still in effect, although nowadays when it becomes hopelessly obsolete. Eternity, never for the society was that much a labor society as it is now when labor itself is made superfluous. Labor turns out to be a totalitarian power that does not tolerate any gods besides itself. Seeps of everyday life into the psyche, controls both thought and action. No expense spared to artificially prolong the lifespan of the labor idol. The paranoia justifies the devastation of natural resources on an intensified scale even if the destructive effect for humanity was realized a long time ago. The vehicles to the full commercialization of any social relationship may be cleared away uncritically, if only a chance for a few miserable jobs to be created. Any job became a confession of faith, which acted from every bow. The more obvious that the labor society is nearing its end, the forcefully this realization is being repressed in public awareness. The repression may be different, but reduced to a common denominator. The global that labor proves to be a self-destructive end in itself is stubbornly redefined into the individual or collective failure of individuals, companies, or entire regions as if the world is under the control of a universally day fixe. The objector of labor has to appear as the subjective problem of those who were already ousted. Employment is the result of exaggerated demands, performance or missing flexibility. To other employment is due to the incompetence, corruption, or greed of politicians or business executives, let alone the inclination of such leaders to pursue policies of treachery. With Roman Herzog, the president of Germany, who said all over the country everybody has to pull together as if the problem was about the motivation of, let us say, a football team or a political section. Keep his or her nose to the grindstone even if the grindstone got pulverized. The message of such incentives cannot be misunderstood. Those who in finding favor in the eyes of the labor idol have to take the blame, kicked off and pushed away. And when to sacrifice humans is valid all over the world. One country gets broken under the wheel of economic totalitarianism, giving evidence for the one and only truth, that has violated the so-called laws of the market economy. The liability will punish any country that does not adapt itself to the blind working of total competition unconditionally and without regard to the consequences. The hope of today is the business rubbish of tomorrow. The raging psychotics won't get shaken in their bizarre worldview, though. Meanwhile, three-quarters of the global population were more or less declared to be social litter. One center after the other is dashed to pieces. After the developing countries and after the failure of the state capitalist squad of the global labor society, the Asian model pupils of market economy have vanished into limbo. Europe, socialism is spreading. However, the politics and management even more grimly continue to crusade in the name of the labor idol.
Every able to live from his work is the propounded principle. Hence that object to acquisition, and there is no right where the qualification cannot be fulfilled. Jörg Haider, Foundation of Natural Law according to the Principles of Scientific Theory, 797.
Chapter 2. The Apartheid Society. Wholesale of the commodity labor power become the exception instead of the rule. A society devoted to the irrational abstraction of labor is inevitably doomed to develop a tendency for social apartheid. All comprehensive all-parties consensus on labor, say the labor camp, on it accepted this logic long ago and even took over a strictly supporting role. Controversy on whether ever-increasing sections of the population shall be pushed to the margin and shall be excluded from social participation, the only controversy on how this social selection is to be pushed through. The Nietzschean trust fully leaves this dirty social Darwinist business to the invisible hand of the markets. This conspires to justify the dismantling of the welfare state, icing those who can no longer keep abreast in the rat race of competition. Only to the smirking brotherhood of globalization winners are awarded the quality of being a human. It that the capitalist end in itself may claim any natural resources of the planet. When they be profitably mobilized, they lie fallow even if entire populations go hungry. The Salvation X, the media, and chair organizations become responsible for that annoying human litter. In the U.S. Central European countries, more people are imprisoned than in any average military dictatorship. In America, today an ever larger number of street urchins and other poor are hunted down by free enterprise death squads than dissidents were killed during the worst periods of political repression. There is no function left for the ostracized, to warning example. Their fate on those who still participate in the rat race of fighting for the leftovers. And have to be kept in hectic moving so that they don't hit on the idea of rebelling against the outrageous impositions they face. Never, even in the price of self-annihilation, for people the brave new world of the totalitarian market economy will only provide for alive and shadow humans in a shady economy. As low-wage democratic serfs of the service society, they've to fawn on the well-off winners of globalization. The poor may shine the shoes of the last businessmen of the dying labor society, may contaminated hamburgers to them, or may security corps to guard their shopping malls. Those who brain on the coat rack may dream of working their way up to the position of a service industry millionaire. In countries this horror scenario is reality, meanwhile as it is in third world countries and Eastern Europe, and is determined to catch up in rapid strides. The Rela papers make no secret of how they imagine the future of labor. The children countries who wash windscreens at polluted crossroads are depicted as the shining example of entrepreneurial initiative and shall serve as a role model for the jobless in the respective local service desert. The role future is the individual as the entrepreneur of his own labor power, being and solely responsible for all his own life, says the Commission on Future Social Questions of the Free States of Bavaria and Saxony. In it, there will be demand for ordinary person-related services. If the rendered become cheaper, i.e. if this provider will earn lower wages. In human self-respect, such statement would trigger off social revolt. In a world of workhorses, it will engender a helpless nod.
The crooking and taken away the worker's wage, even so. Now shall labor without a wage, while picturing to himself the blessing of success and profit in his prison cell. But labor he shall be trained to perform moral labor as a free personal act. Wilhelm Rehl, Die Arbeit, The German Labor, A61.
Chapter 3. The Neo-State. The faction of the socially all-embracing labor camp cannot bring itself to the liking of such a perspective. On the hand, they are convinced that a human being that has no job is not a human being at all. Nauseated on the post-war era of mass employment, down to the idea of reviving the labor society. The nation shall fix what the markets are incapable of. The purport of a labor society is to be simulated by means of job programs, organized compulsory labor for people on dole or welfare, subsidies, debt, and other fees of this sort. The hash of a state-regulated labor camp has no chance at all, but remains the ideological point of departure for broad stratums of the population who are already on the brink of disaster. Subs put into practice are anything else but emancipatory. Transformation of scarce labor, labor market, prime civil right necessarily excludes all foreigners. The social election then is not questioned, but redefined. The dual struggle for survival shall be diffused by means of ethnic nationalistic criteria. Domestically for native citizens is the outcry deep from the bottom of the people's soul, who are able to combine motivated by their perverse lust for labor. Capitalism makes no secret of such sentiment. Its civil society only amounts to ethnic cleansing within the shrinking zones of capitalist wealth. Where nationalism of social democrats or greens is set on treating the old established immigrants like natives and can even imagine naturalizing those people should they be able to prove themselves harmless and affable. Thereby the exclusion of refugees from the Eastern and African world can be legitimized in a populist manner even better and without getting into a fuss. Of course the whole ration is well obscured by talking 19 to the dozen about humanity and civilization. Mental immigrants allegedly sneaking in domestic jobs shall not leave behind nasty bloodstains or burn marks on German soil. Rather the border police, forces in general, and states of Skangenland, which is of the problem lawfully and best of all far away from media coverage. The stimulation is violent and repressive by birth. Its absolute will to maintain the rule of the labor idol by all means, even at its decease. This like fanaticism will not grant peace to those who resorted to the very last hideouts of a welfare state already fallen into ruins, i.e. ousted, jobs, or let alone refusing to labor for good reasons. And employment agents will haul them before the official interrogation commissions, them to kowtow before the throne of the ruling corpse. Usually given the benefit of doubt, but here the of proof is shifted. Socialists not want to live on air and Christian charity for their further lives, they accept whatsoever dirty and slave work, other absurd occupational therapy cooked up by job creation schemes, demonstrate their unconditional readiness for labor. Whether rhyme or reason, not to many meaning, or the realization of pure absurdity, does not at all. The jobless are kept moving to remind them incessantly of the one and only law governing their existence on earth. In people work to earn money. Government spares no expenses to simulate the labor paradise for some 100,000 people by launching bizarre job training schemes or setting up training companies in order to make them fit for regular jobs they will never get. Ever new steps are taken to keep up the appearance that the idle running social treadmills can be kept in full swing to the end of time. The moral constraint of labor becomes, the morally it is hammered into the people's head that they cannot even get a piece of bread for free. In new labor and its imitators all over the world concur with the neoliberal scheme of social selection. In holding out beguiling prospects of a wonderful future for the labor society, a fertile legitimacy is created to crack down on the jobless and labor objectors more fiercely. At the same labor, subsidy wages, and so-called citizen activity bring down labor cost, entail massively inflated low-wage sector and an increase in other lousy jobs of that sort. The evading workfare does even not spare persons who suffer from chronic disease or single mothers with little children. Retail benefits are released from this administrative stranglehold only as soon as the nameplate is tied to their toe, mortuary. The only way of obtrusiveness is to discourage as many people as possible from claiming benefits at all by displaying dreadful instruments of torture. Any miserable job must appear comparatively pleasant. A socialist state always only swings the whip out of love and with the intention of sternly training its children, denies work shy, to be in the name of their better progress. The pedagogical measures only have the goal to drum the wards out. What else is scripting unemployed people and forcing them to go to the fields to harvest asparagus, It is meant Polish seasonal workers, who slave wages only because the exchange rate turns the pittance they get into an acceptable income at home. Are neither helped nor given any vocational perspective with this measure. Even growers, gruntled academics and reluctant skilled workers, to them as a present, are but a nuisance. When, day, the idea of setting up a hot dog stand as an act of desperation suddenly appears in a more friendly light, the flexibility has its desired neo-British of court.
Any job, no job. Bill, 1988. No job is as hard as no job. September 1998 rally. Organize initiatives for unemployed people. Citizen work should be rewarded, not paid. Whoever citizen work clears himself of the stigma of being unemployed and being a recipient of welfare benefits. The Soul of Democracy, 1997.
Chapter. Example of the labor religion. The new labor with which society reacts to the death of its idol is the logical continuation and final stage of a long history. Of the Reformation, all hours of Western modernization have preached the sacredness of work. Over 150 years, social theories and political schools were possessed by the idea of labor. Social conservatives, Democrat-fascists fought each other to the death, but all deadly hatred. They always homage to the labor idol together. Push the aside, is from the German lyrics of the International Working, Laboring, Anthem, Labor. It resounds eerily from the inscription above the gate in Auschwitz. The pluralist democracies all the more swore by the everlasting dictatorship of labor. Even of the ultra-Catholic state of Bavaria lectures its citizens in the Lutheran tradition, lays the source of a people's prosperity and is subject to the special protective state. At the 10th century, all ideal differences have vanished into thin air. What remains around of a merciless dogma, is the natural destiny of human beings. Today the labor society itself denies that dogma. The labor religion have always preached that a human being, according to posed nature, is an laborans, working/animal. Sexually only assumes the quality of being a human by subjecting matter to his will and in realizing himself in his products, as one Prometheus. The modern process has always made a mockery of this myth of a world conqueror and a demigod, but a real substratum in the era of inventor capitalists like Siemens or Edison and their skilled workforce. Meanwhile, however, and graces became completely absurd. Whoever content, meaning, and goal or her job, will go or becomes a disruptive element in the social machinery designed to function as an end in itself. Homo, one of conceit as to his craft and trade, a type of who took seriously what he did in a parochial way, come as old-fashioned as a mechanical typewriter. The run at all cost, and all there is to it. Admins and armies of entertainers, companyologists, imagers and drug dealers are responsible for creating meaning. Where they babble about motivation and creativity, there is trace left of either of them save self-deception. This is as autosuggestion, self-action and competence simulation rank among the most important virtues of managers and skilled workers, MERs and accountants, teachers, parking lot guards. The labor society has completely ridiculed the claim that labor is an eternal necessity imposed on humanity by nature. Force preached that homage has to be paid to the labor idol just for the simple reason that needs cannot be satisfied without humans sweating blood. To satisfy needs, the whole point of the human labor camp existence. If true, a critique of labor would be as rational as a critique of gravity. So have nature enter into a state of crisis or even disappear. The floor society's labor camp factions, neoliberal gluttons for caviar to labor unionist beer bellies, find themselves running out of arguments to prove the pseudo-nature of labor. Or claim that 3/4 of humanity are sinking in misery and poverty only because the labor system no longer needs their labor. It is not Old Testament in the sweat of your face you shall eat your bread that is to burden the ostracized any longer, but a new durable condemnation, you shall eat because your sweat is superfluous and unmarketable. That is law of nature. This is nothing but an irrational social principle, which the appearance of a natural compulsion because it has destroyed or subjugated any other form of social relations over the past centuries and has declared itself to be absolute. It is the society that regards itself as very rational, but it only follows the instrumental rationality of its labor idol for whose factual inevitabilities, it is to sacrifice the last remnant of its humanity.
Work, is all connected with nature. The work leads more and more to the truth and to the laws and prescriptions nature, which are truths. Thomas Lyle, Working Despairing, 1883.
Chapter 5. Labor Social Principle. Labor identical with humans transforming nature, matter, and interacting with each other. As mind exist, they will build, producing food and other things. They will run, rice, discuss, cultivate gardens, and make and much more. This is evident. The raising human activity as such, the expenditure of labor power, to enact principle governing social relations without regard to its content and independent of the needs and will of the participants, is not evident. In societies, there are all sorts of domination and personal dependencies, but not leadership of the abstraction labor. Active formation of nature and in social relations were in no way self-determined, but were subject to an abstract expenditure of labor power. Rather, they were in complex rules of religious prescriptions and in social and cultural traditions with mutual obligations. Every its own time and scene, simply no abstract general form of activity. It felt commodity-producing system as an end in itself with its ceaseless transformation of human energy into money to bring about a separated sphere of so-called labor alienated from all other social relations and abstracted from all content. It is of its inmates' unconditional surrender, dependent activity severed from any other social context, obedience to an abstract economic instrumental rationality beyond human needs. Inched from life, time is to be lived and experienced, time, becomes a mere raw material to be exploited optimally, time money. Any is charged to a time account, ep to the lieu is an offense, and ESIP is a crime against the production goal that has made itself independent. Where on, only apt energy may be spent. Lie elsewhere or nowhere, but labor beats the time round the clock. Even to obey Newtonian time to members of the workforce in their future life. Leave invented merely to restore an individual's labor power. When having, rating or making love, hand is ticking at the back of one's mind. In this it does not matter what is being done, it is the doing itself that counts. Above is an end in itself, especially in the respect that it is the raw material and substance of monetary capital, yields the limitless dynamic of capital as self-valorizing value. Labor is liquid, motion, aggregate absurd end in itself. That must be produced as commodities and not for any practical reason. Form products can solidify the abstraction money, whose is the abstraction labor. Some of the alienated social treadmill holding captive modern humanity. For reason, it doesn't matter what is being produced as well as what use is made of it, not to mention the indifference to social and environmental consequences. Whether or landmines are produced, whether are printed or genetically modified tomatoes are grown, whether people fall sick as a result, whether it gets polluted or only good taste goes to the dogs, all this is irrelevant as long as what it takes, goodies can be transformed into money and money into fresh labor. The faculty demands a concrete use, and should be a destructive one, has relevance for the economic rationality for which the product is nothing but a carrier of one's expended labor, or the accumulated labor, in words capital, material in the money form is the only meaning the modern commodity producing system knows about. What is labor? A menace. Yes, but a menace that has become concrete reality, a fied madness that holds this society in its iron grip. In perpetuating, people interact as self-reliant social beings, but only execute the presupposed end in itself as social automatons.
The worker, lit. Lay himself outside work and feels outside himself when working. He does not work. When he is not home. As a result, it is forced labor, voluntary labor. Forced satisfaction of a need but only a means for satisfying needs outside labor. It's in that labor is avoided as a plague as soon as no physical or other force exists. Cox, Econ-Philosophical Manuscripts, 1854.
Chapter 6. Labor are the two sides of the same coin. The political was eagerly venerated labor. It labored to be the true nature of a human being and mystified it into the supposed counter-principle of capital. Not regarded as a scandal, but exploitation by capital. As the pro-all working class parties was always the liberation of labor and not liberation from labor. Yet the sin of capital and labor is only the opposition of different, yet unequally powerful, interest in the capitalist end in itself. Class form of battling out opposite interests on the common social ground and reference system of the commodity-producing system. It was the dynamics of capital accumulation. Whether this are wages, civil rights, or working conditions or more jobs, the all-racing social treadmill with its irrational principles was always its implied presupposition. From labor, the creative content of production counts as little as it does from the standpoint of capital. The only is selling labor power at best price. The determining aim and object of human activity by joint decision is beyond the imagination of the treadmill inmates. If existed that such self-determination of social reproduction could be realized in the forms of the commodity-producing system, the force has long forgotten about this illusion. Only implication is a matter of concern. Connotations of these terms speak volumes about the end in itself character of the whole arrangement, and the state of mental immaturity of the participants comes to light. What and to what end, and what the consequences, neither matters the seller of the commodity labor power nor to its buyer. Nuclear power plants and chemical factories protest the loudest when their ticking time bombs are deactivated. The Volkswagen, Ford or are the most fanatical disciples of the automobile suicide program, not because they are compelled to sell themselves for a living wage, but because they actually identify with their parochial existence. Unionists, past and other professional theologians of the social question regard this as a proof for the ethical moral value of labor. Liminality, they say. Yes, the Perseus of zombies of the commodity production who can no longer imagine a life outside of their dearly loved treadmills, for drill themselves hard day in, day out. As the word hardly ever the antagonistic contradiction to capital or the historical subject of human emancipation, capital and managers hardly control society by means of the malevolence of some subjective will of exploitation. No in history has led such a wretched life as a bondman as the harassed managers of Microsoft, Chrysler or Sony. would have deeply despised these people. While leisure and squandered wealth orgiastically, the labor society does not allow itself any pause. Else, they don't anything else but to become childish. Legal cognition, realism discovery, as visual pleasures, are foreign to them as to their human resource. Slaves of the labor idol, mere funcutives of the irrational social end in itself. The route how to enforce its subjectless, Marx, will bias of the silent, implied, competition to which even the powerful must bow, especially they manage hundreds of factories and shift billions across the globe. If they don't be scrapped as ruthlessly as the superfluous labor force. Strings of intransigent systemic constraints, they become a public menace by this and not because of some conscious will to exploit others. Least of all are they to ask about the meaning and consequences of their restless action and cannot afford emotions or compassion. Therefore, when they devastate the world, for urban features, only shrug their shoulders when their fellow beings are impoverished in the midst of affluence.
More has the good conscience on its side. The incline for leisure is called need of recovery and begins to feel ashamed of itself. Its ache of health, they themselves when caught at a country outing. It could near future that succumbing to a vita contemplativa, I go for a stroll together with friends to contemplate life, will self-contempt and a guilty conscience. Nietzsche, and Idleness, 882.
Chapter 7. Labarcal rule. It to subject every sphere of social life or all essential human activities to the rule of abstract, new time, even if the logic of labor includes transformation of the latter into money substance, insists on it. Outside the separated sphere of labor, so at the rear, the sphere home life, and it came into being. It conveys the idea of femininity and comprises the various activities of everyday life which can only rarely be transformed into monetary remuneration. From cleaning, cooking, childing, and the care of elderly, to the of love provided by the ideal housewife, who busies herself with loving care for her exhausted breadwinner and refuels his emptiness with well-measured doses of emotion. That is intimacy, which is not the reverse side of the labor sphere, is used as the sanctuary of true life by bourgeois ideology. In reality it is most often a familiarity hell. In fact, it is no fear of better or true life, but a heel and reduced form of existence, a mere inversion subject to the very same systemic constraints, i.e. labor. The sea is an offshoot of the labor sphere, and in its own meanwhile, but bound to the riding common reference system. Without the female labor, labor actually never have worked. The female implied precondition of the labor society and at the same time its specific result. The same gender stereotypes being generalized in the course of the developing commodity-producing system. It was that the image of the somewhat primitive, instinctive, irrational, and immoral woman solidified only along with the image of the civilized, rational self-restrained male workaholic and became a mass prejudice finally. It was also that the self-drill of the white man, who went some sort of mental boot camp training to cope with the exacting demands of labor and its pertinent human resource management, coincides with a brutal witch hunt that raged for some centuries. The modeling and appropriation of the world by means of natural, civic thought, a way of that was gaining ground then, was culminated by the social end in itself and its gender attributes down to the roots. This way, the white man, in order to ensure his smooth functioning, did himself to a self-exorcism of all evil spirits, names frames of mind and emotional needs, considered to be dysfunctional in the realms of labor. In theory, as in the post-war democracies of Fordism, women were only recruited to the labor system, which resulted in some specific female schizophrenic mind. On the one hand, the entrance of women into the sphere of labor has not led to their liberation, but submitted them to very same drill procedures for the labor idol as already suffered by men. On the end, as this structure of segregation was left untouched, the setted sphere of female labor continued to exist extrinsic to what is officially deemed to be labor. This, women subjected to a double burden and exposed to conflicting social imperatives. Within her until now they are predominantly confined to the low-wage sector and subordinate jobs. No alarming struggle for quota regulations or equal career chances will change anything. The misrepresentation of a compatibility of career and family leaves completely untouched the separation of the spheres of the commodity-producing system and thereby preserves the structure of gender segregation. For women such an outlook on life is unbearable. A mine of fat cats, however, may rise the social conditions to attain a winner position within the social apartheid system by delegating housework and childcare to poorly paid, obviously feminine, servants. Due to the restraints of the labor society and its total usurpation of the individual, in particular entailing his or her unconditional surrender to the systemic logic, and mobile obedience to the capitalist time regime in society as a whole, the sacred sphere of so-called private life and holy family is eroded and degraded more and more. The paid not abolished, but run the unacknowledged crisis of the labor society. As the producing system gradually collapses at present, we made responsible for survival in any respect, masculine world indulges in the prolongation of the categories of the labor society by means of simulation.
Mankind mutilate itself to create its identical, functional, male and so it has to be redone in everybody's childhood. Max Horkheimer / Theodore W. Adorno, Dialectic of Enlightenment.
Labor, humans in bondage. The identity and bondman existence can be shown factually and conceptually. Only days ago, people were quite aware of the connection between labor and social constraints. In languages, the term originally referred only to the activities carried out by humans in bondage, bondmen, and slaves. In areas, the word depicted the drudgery of an orphaned child fallen into serfdom. The rare meant staggering under a heavy burden and conveyed the suffering and toil of slaves. The Roman veil, tribaggio, etc., from the Latin tripolium, a kind used for the torture and punishment of slaves and other humans in bondage. Suffering is still discernible in the German idiom to bend under the yoke of labor. Thus labor, a coarse root, is an synonym for self-determined human activity, but an unfortunate social fate. It is those who have lost their freedom. The error on all members of society is nothing but the generalization of a life in bondage, and the worship of labor is merely the quasi-religious transfiguration of the actual social conditions. For, however, it was possible to repress the conjunction between labor and bondage successfully and to internalize the social impositions because in the developing commodity-producing system, the generation of labor was accompanied by its reification. Most people are no longer under the thumb of a personal master. Humans transformed into a social totality of abstract domination discernible everywhere, but proved wherever a slave, one is simultaneously a master, that is slaver of his own person and his very own slave driver and warder. All a based idol, brother of capital valorization, who harm to the tripolium. The blubber. The age is the history of the enforcement of labor, which brought devastation and horror to the planet in its trail. The waste the most of one's lifetime under abstract systemic orders was not always as internalized as today. Rather, it took centuries of brute force and violence on a large scale to literally torture people into the unconditional service of the labor idol. It did some innocent market expansion meant to increase the wealth of His or Her Majesty's subjects, the insatiable hunger for money of the absolutist apparatus of state to finance the early modern military machinery. The demand merchants and financial capital beyond traditional trade relations only accelerated through this apparatus, which the whole society in a bureaucratic stranglehold for the first time in history. Money became a central social motive and the abstraction of labor a central social constraint without regard to actual needs. Most voluntarily go over to production for anonymous markets and thereby to a general cash economy, but to do so because the absolutist hunger for money led to the levy of pecuniary and ever-increasing taxes, replacing all payment in kind. It was not to earn money for themselves, but militarized early modern firearm state, its lex, and its ocracy. This end in itself of capital valorization and thus of labor came into the world. Only after revenue became insufficient, bureaucrats and finance capital administrators began to forcibly and directly organize people as the material of a social machinery for the transformation of labor into money. The true life and existence of the population was vandalized as this population was earmarked to be the human material for the valorization machine put on steam. Peasants driven from their fields by force of arms to clear space for sheep farming, used the raw material for the wool manufactories. Like free hunting, fishing, and wandering in the forests were abolished. When the asses then marched through the land begging and stealing, they were up in workhouses and manufactories and abused with labor torture machines to beat the slave consciousness of a submissive serf into them. The flow people gave up their additional life of their own accord to join the armies of a bourgeoising prospects of labor society is a downright lie. The graduation of their subjects into material for the money-generating labor idol was not enough to satisfy the absolutist monster states. They extend to other continents. Europeanization was accompanied by outer colonization, in the Americas, then its of Africa. Here the Whipper finally cast aside all scruples. In an crusade of looting, and genocide, they halted the newly discovered worlds. The victims overseas were not even considered to be human beings. Ballistic European powers of the dawning labor society defined the subjugated foreign cultures as savages and cannibals. This purification to exterminate or enslave millions of them. Colonial plantations and raw materials industry to an extent exceeding ancient slaveholding by far, with the founding crimes of the commodity-producing system. Here by means of labor was realized on a large scale for the first time. This foundation crime of the labor society. The white man, all branded by the ravages of self-discipline, could conquer his repressed self-hatred and inferiority complex by taking it out on the savages. Like men, people were deemed to be primitive halflings ranking in between animals and humans. It was his keen conjecture that baboons could talk if they only wanted and didn't speak because they feared being dragged off to labor. Seasoning casts a revealing light on the Enlightenment. The ethos of the modern age, which original Protestant version relied on God's grace and since the Enlightenment on natural law, was just as a civilizing mission. Civilizance means the voluntary submission to labor, and is male, Western. The non-human, an unsist nature, is female, called exotic, and be kept in bondage. In a word, the universe of the labor society is perfectly racist by its origin. The extraction of labor can always only define itself by demarcating itself from everything that can't be squared with its own categories. The Mosee, who inherited absolutism, is descendant of the peaceful merchants who once traveled the old trading routes. Rather it condottieri, early mercenary gangs, overseers, penitentiary wards, the whole farmers general, slavers and other cutthroats of this sort, who prepared the social hotbed for modern entrepreneurship. The burdens of the 18th and 19th century had nothing to do with social emancipation. They assured the balance of power within the arising coercive system, separate institutions of the labor society from the antiquated dynastic interests and pressed ahead with reification and depersonalization. Is French Revolution that histrionically proclaimed compulsory labor, a law on the elimination of begging, and arranged for new labor penitentiaries without delay. This opposite of what was struggled for by rebellious social movements of a different character flaring up on the fringes of the bourgeois revolutions. Complete forms of resistance and disobedience existed long before, but the historiography of the modern labor society cannot make sense of it. The prodigal agrarian societies, who put up with feudal rule completely not willing to come to terms with the prospect of forming the working class of a system extrinsic to their life. A chain of events, from peasants' revolts of the 15th and 16th century, the Luddite risings in Britain, announced as the revolt of backwards fools, to the Sutton Weavers' Rebellion in 1844, gives for the embittered resistance against labor. The basement of the labor society and the sometimes open and sometimes latent civil war were one and the same. The old societies were anything but heaven on earth. However, the majority experienced the enormous constraints of the dawning labor society as a change to the worse and a time of despair. Of their existence, people had something to lose. What appears and plague of the misrepresented Middle Ages to the erroneous awareness of the modern times is in reality the horror of the history of modern age. The modern white-collar or factory employee are longer than the annual or daily time spent on social reproduction by any pre-capitalist or non-capitalist civilization side or outside Europe. Such action was not devoted to efficiency, but characterized by a culture of leisure and relative slowness. Apart from masters, societies were able to provide for the basic material needs of their members, in fact even better than it has been the case for long periods of modern history or is the case in the present world crisis. Further, Darwin couldn't get that deep under the skin as in our thoroughly bureaucratist labor society. This against labor could only be smashed by military force. Even now, the ecologists of the labor society resort to cant to cover up that the civilization of the pre-modern producers did not peacefully evolve into a capitalist society, drowned in its own blood. The Democrats of today preferably shift the blame for all these atrocities onto the so-called pre-democratic conditions of a past they have nothing to do with. They see that the terrorist history of the modern age is quite revealing as to nature of the contemporary labor society. The Bureau administration and state-run registration mania and control freakery in industrial democracies has never been able to deny its absolutist and colonial origins. By reification to create an impersonal systemic context, the human resource management, out in the name of the labor idol, has intensified and meanwhile pervades all spheres of life. Days at labor. The bureaucratic grip can be felt as it was felt in the early days of the labor society. Labor turns out to be a coercive system that has always organized social apartheid and seeks in vain to banish the crisis by means of democratic state slavery. At the same time, the evonial spirit returns to the countries at the periphery of capitalist wealth, national economies that are already ruined by the dozen. The Intermonetary Fund assumes the position of an official receiver to bleed white the leftovers. After the idol, the society, still hope for deliverance, falls on the methods of its founding crimes, even already beyond salvation.
The barbarian differs from the scholar by musing apathetically, since pickle culture means to busy oneself out of habit and to feel a need for occupation. George Hegel, General Lines of the Philosophy of Right, in 21 actually one begins to feel that this of labor is the best police conceivable, because it's a tight rein on everybody hindering effectively the evolution of sensibility, action, and the dare for independence. Fumes nerve power to an extraordinary extent, to platter as to contemplation, musing, dreaming, concern, love, hatred. Frida, The Use of Labor, 1881.
Chapter 10. The movement was a movement for labor. The working class movement, which would rise until long after the fall of the old social revolts, did not struggle against the impositions of labor but developed an over-identification with the seemingly inevitable. This was on workers' rights and the amelioration of living conditions within the reference system of the labor society whose social constraints were largely internalized. Instead of emphasizing the transformation of human energy into money as an irrational end in itself, the movement took the standpoint of labor and understood capital valorization as a neutral given fact. Thus the world stepped into the shoes of absolutism, progressism and bourgeois enlightenment. The misfortunes converted into the false pride of labor, redefined domestication the fully fledged working class had went through for the purposes of the modern idol into a human right. The so to speak ideologically turned the tables and developed a missionary fervor to demand both the right to work and a general obligation to work. They didn't in their capacity as the executives of the labor society but abused them, the other way around, in the labor, by parasites. With option, all members of the society should be forcibly recruited to the armies of labor. Though itself became the pacemaker of the capitalist labor society, in the last stages of reification within the labor system's development process and prevailing against the narrow-minded bourgeois officials of the 19th and early 20th century. It's quite similar to what had happened only 100 years before when the bourgeoisie stepped into the shoes of absolutism. This was only because the workers' parties and trade unions, due to the vacation of labor, relied on the machinery and its institutions of repressive labor management in an affirmative way. That's heard to them to abolish the state-run administration of human material and simultaneously the state itself. Instead, they were to ease the systemic power by means of what they called the march through the institutions. In Germany, there, like bourgeoisie had done earlier, the movement adopted the bureaucratic tradition of labor management and stork. Forces, wondered up by absolutism. How, the ideology of a social generalization of labor required a reconstruction of the political sphere. States with its differentiation as to political rights, for a class system of franchise, being worse when the labor system was just halfway carried through, had placed by the general democratic equality of the finalized labor state. Further, evenness in the running of the valorization machine, especially when felt as a harmful impact by society as whole, had to be balanced by welfare state intervention. In fact, too, it was the workers' movement who brought forth the paradigm. Under democracy it became the largest bourgeois action group in history, but trapped in its own snare though. In anything may be subject to negotiation except for the intrinsic constraints of the labor society, constitute the axiomatic preconditions implied. What is confined to the modalities and the handling of those? There is always between Coca-Cola and Pepsi, between pestilence and cholera, impudence and dullness, between Schroeder. The inherent in the labor society is the ever most perfidious system of domination in history, a system of self-oppression. That democracy never organizes its members' free decision on how the available resources shall be utilized, but is only concerned with the constitution of the legal fabric forming the reference system for the socially segregated labor monads compelled to market themselves under the law of competition. Democracy act opposite of freedom. As a consequence, the humans are necessarily divided into administrators and subjects of administration, employees, in the truth of the word, function and human material. The inner political parties, apply labor parties in particular, are edge of the prevailing social dynamic. Leaders and celebs and celebrators, nepotism works and opportunists, those related terms are producing evidence of the essence of a social structure that as not free debate and free decision. It is part of the logic of the system that the elite itself is just a dependent functional element of the labor idol and its blind resolutions. ever seized power. Any political party is a labor party and a capitalist party at the same time. In societies of the East and South, the labor mutated into parties of state terrorism to enable catch-up modernization. In Westries they became part of a system of people's parties with exchangeable party manifestos and media representatives. Class over because labor society's time is up. Society is passing away, clattering out to be mere functional categories of a common social fetish system. Whenever Democrats, Greens, and Communists distinguish themselves by outlining exceptionally perfidious repression schemes, they be nothing but the legitimate heirs of the workers' movement, which wanted anything else but labor at all cost.
Labor scepter, soon shall be the idler's fate, labor to rule the world as labor is the essence of the world. For Der Arbeiter, in honor of labor, 1903.
Chevin. Thicker. For a moment after the Second World War, it seemed the labor society, based on stick industries, had dated into a system of eternal prosperity, pacifying the unbearable end in itself by means of mass consumption and welfare state amenities. That this idea was always an idea of democratic hell, it's meant to become reality only for a small minority of world population, it turned out to be foolish even in the capitalist centers. With the revolution of microelectronics, the society reached its absolute historical barrier. That they reached sooner or later was logically foreseeable. The commodusing system suffers from a fatal contradiction in terms. On the one hand, it lives massive intake of human energy generated by the expenditure of pure labor power, the more the better. On the other hand, the operational competition enforces a permanent increase in productivity, bringing about the replacement of human labor power by scientific operational industrial capital. In terms was in fact the underlying cause for all of the earlier crises, them the disastrous world economic crisis of 1929-33. Due to compensation, it's possible to get over those crises time and again. After a certain period, then based higher level of productivity attained, the addition of the market to fresh groups of buyers led to an intake of more labor power in absolute numbers than was previously rationalized away. Less had to be spent per product, but more produced absolutely to such an extent that this reduction was overcompensated. As innovations exceeded process innovations, it is possible to transform the self-contradiction of the system into an expansion process. The historical example is the automobile line and other techniques of Taylorism, the expertise, first introduced in Henry Ford's auto factory in Detroit. The necessary labor time per auto was reduced to a fraction. The working was enormously condensed, but the human material was drained many times over the previous level in ratio to the same labor time interval. Above all, the car, up to luxury article for the upper 10,000, made available to mass consumption due to the lower price. This insatiable appetite of the labor idle for human energy was satisfied on a higher level despite rationalized assembly line production in the times of the Second Industrial Revolution of Fordism. At the same time, the auto case in point for the destructive character of the highly developed mode of production and consumption in the labor society. In the introduction of cars and private car use on a huge scale, the landscape being buried under concrete and the environment is being polluted. And to the undeclared Third World War raging on the roads and routes of this world, a war claiming millions of casualties, maimed year in, year out, shrugging it off. The compensation becomes defunct in the course of the Third Industrial Revolution of microelectronics. It is true electronics many products were reduced in price and new products were created, above all area of the media. First time, the speed of process innovation is greater than the speed of product innovation. More localized away than can be reabsorbed by expansion of markets. As a consequence of rationalization, electronics replaces human energy or new communication technology makes labor superfluous, respectively. And departments of construction, production, marketing, warehousing, distribution, management vanish into thin air. For a time, the idle unintentionally confines itself to permanent hunger rations, thereby brought its very own death. As the democratic society is a mature and in itself system of self-referential labor power expenditure, like a feedback circuit, it is impossible to switch over to a general reduction in working hours within its forms. On the one hand, economic-administrative rationality requires that an ever-increasing number of people become permanently jobless and cut off from the reproduction of their life as inherent in the system. On the other hand, the constantly decreasing number of employees is suffering from overworking and is subject to an even more intense efficiency pressure. In the wealth, poverty and hunger are coming home to the capitalist centers. Production shut down, and parts of arable land lie fallow. Graves and public buildings are vacant, where the number of homeless persons is on the increase. Cap becomes a global minority event. In US, the labor idol has become auto-cannibalistic. In search for food, it breaks up the boundaries of national economy and globalizes by means of nomadic cutthroat competition. Entire world are cut off from the global flows of capital and commodities. In an wave of mergers and hostile takeovers, globals get ready for the final battle of private entrepreneurship. The states and nations implode. Their populations, driven by the struggle for survival, tether in ethnic gang wars.
The principle is the right of the person to his work. Thing more detestable than an idle life. Not to that. Says no room for idlers. Henry itself is the moving contradiction, in that it is to reduce labor time to a minimum, while posits labor time, on the other side, as soldier and source of wealth. On the one, then, if all the powers of science and of nature, as of social combination and of social intercourse, in order to make the creation of wealth independent, relatively, labor time employed on it. On the other, it wants labor time as the measuring rod for the giant social forces thereby created, and to find them within the limits required to maintain the already created value as value. Karl Marx, of the Critique of Political Economy, 857/8.
12. The necessity of labor entails the crisis of state and politics. In principle, the state owes its career to the fact that the commodity-producing system is in need of an overarching authority guaranteeing the general preconditions of competition, the general foundations, preconditions for the valorization process inclusive of a repression apparatus in case human material defaults the systemic imperatives and becomes insubordinate. Organized in the form of bourgeois democracy, the state to increasingly take on socio-economic functions in the 20th century. It's funded to the provision of social services but comprises public health, transportation, community and postal service, as well as infrastructures of all kinds. The latter state-supervised services are essential for the working of the labor society, but not be organized as a private enterprise valorization process. Private-public services are most often nothing but street. 8. Concise. The rule that such infrastructure must be available for the society as a whole on a permanent basis and cannot follow the market cycles of supply and demand. As the valorization unit in its own and thus not able to transform labor into money, it has off money from the actual valorization process to finance its state functions. If the value comes to a standstill, the coffee empty. The state, purport the social sovereign, proves completely dependent on the blindly raging, privatized economy specific to the labor society. The state's many bills as it wants, if the of production, the jet powers of humanity, out the system of labor, law, conduct and applicable only in relation to the subjects of labor, leads nowhere. As for increasing mass unemployment, revenue and the taxation of earned income drain away. The C-net rips as soon as the number of superfluous people constitutes a critical mass that has to be fed by the redistribution of monetary yields generated elsewhere in the capitalist system. However, with the rapid process of capital in crisis, exceed boundaries of national economies, state avenues from the taxation of corporate profits drain away as well. The power exerted by transnational corporations on national economies, who are eating for foreign investment, results dumping, dismantling of the welfare state, and the down of environment protection standards. The democratic state mutates into a mere crisis administrator. The more this financial emergency, the more reduced to its repressive core. It cut down to proportions just meeting the requirements of transnational capital. As is in the colonies, logistics are increasingly restricted to a few economic centers while the rest of the territory becomes wasteland. Watatized is privatized, even more and more people are excluded from the most essential supplies. When the value concentrates on only a few world market havens, a comprehensive supply system to satisfy the needs of the population as a whole does not matter any longer. Whether there's or postal service available is only relevant in respect to trade, industry, and financial markets. Educates the privilege of the globalization winners. Intellectual, art, and theoretical culture is weighed against the criterion of marketability and fades away. A widening ruins public health service, giving rise to a class system of medical care. Syrup gradually at the beginning, eventual callous candor, the law of euthanasia is promulgated, because poor and superfluous, you will die early. In the fields in education, culture, and infrastructure, knowledge, skill, tech and methods along with the necessary equipment are available in abundance. However, to the subject to sufficient funds, the latter objectifying the irrational law of the labor society, any of those capacities and capabilities has to be kept under lock and key, or be demobilized and scrapped. This is a means of production in farming and industry as soon as they turn out to be unprofitable. Oppressive labor simulation imposed on people by means of forced labor and low-wage regime along with the cutback of social security payments, the democratic state that already transformed into an apartheid system has nothing on offer for his ex-labor subjects. Advanced stage, the administration as such will disintegrate. The state degenerate into a corrupt kleptocracy, then forces into mafia-structured war gangs, and these force no poll can stop this process or even reverse it. By its is related to social organization in the form of state. When the foundation edifice crumble, policies become baseless. Day after, the democratic formula of the political shaping, of living makes a fool of itself more and more. Apart repression, the goal elimination of civilization, and terror of economy, there is enough to shape. As the self-specific to the labor society is an axiomatic presupposition of Western democracy, there is no basis for political democratic regulation when labor is in crisis. This is the end of politics. Chapter 18. The simulation of labor society. The predominance deceives itself systematically about the actual state of the labor society. Collapsins are excommunicated ideologically, market statistics are distorted unscrupulously, and form impoverishment are simulated away by the media. Central feature of crisis capitalism anyway. This is the economy itself. If at the heart of the Western world it seems that capital accumulation is possible without labor employed and that money as a pure form is able to guarantee the further valorization of value out of itself, such is owing to the simulation process going on at financial markets. as a labor simulation by means of coercive measures imposed by the labor administration authorities, a section of capital valorization developed from the speculative uncoupling of the credit system and equity market from the actual economy. Present employed is replaced by the tapping of future time labor that will never be employed in reality, capital accumulation taking place in some fictitious future too, so to speak. Monetary no longer can profitably be reinvested in active assets, and therefore unable to consume labor, has increased to resort to financial markets. Boom of capital valorization in the heydays of the so-called economic miracle after World War II was not entirely self-sustaining, as if to finance the basic preconditions of labor society. Otherwise, the state to deficit spending to an unprecedented extent. The crest exceeded revenue from taxation by far. The state pledged its future actual revenue as a collateral security. On the other hand, this investment opportunity for superfluous moneyed capital was created, lent the state on interest. The interest payment by raising fresh credit, thereby back the borrowed money into economic circulation. On the other, this implied social security expenditure and public spending on infrastructure was financed by way of credit. In of capitalist logic, an artificial demand was created which was not covered by productive labor power expenditure. By taxation, the labor city prolonged the lifetime of the Fordistic boom beyond its actual span. This meant, being ration even in times of a seemingly intact valorization process, came against limiting factors in line with the amount of indebtedness of the state. Crisis in the capitalist sectors as well as in third world countries put an end to the stimulation of economic growth by means of deficit spending and laid the foundation for the triumphant advance of neoliberal deregulation policies. According to ecology, deregulation can only be effected in line with a sweeping reduction of the public sector share in national product and reality costs and expenses arising from crisis management, is government spending on the repression apparatus or national expenditure for the maintenance of the simulation machinery, due cost saving from deregulation and the reduction of state functions. In many cases, the public share even expanded as a result. Not possible to simulate the further accumulation of capital by means of deficit spending any longer. Consequently, in the last century, the creation of fictitious capital shifted to the equity market. Dividend, the real profit, is a concern, stock price gains, the speculative increase in value of the legal title up to an astronomical magnitude, which the ratio to speculative price movements turned upside down. The price advance no longer anticipates real economic expansion, but conversely, the bolt of fictitious net profit generation simulates a real accumulation that no longer exists. Clinically, the idol is kept breathing artificially by means of a seemingly self-induced expansion of financial markets. Industrializations show profits that don't come from operating income, production and sale of goods, a loss-making branch of business for a long time, but from the clever speculation of their financial departments in stocks and currency. Items shown in the budgets of public authorities are not yielded by taxation or public borrowing, but in participation of fiscal administrations in the financial gambling markets. Families and households whose real income from wages or salaries is dropping dramatically, keep spending spree habit by using stocks and prospective price gains as a collateral for consumer credits. Once again, a new of artificial demand is created, resulting in production and revenue built upon sandy ground. This is a dilatory tactic to defer the global economic crisis. As the fict in the value of legal titles is only the anticipation of future labor employed, to astronomical magnitude, that will be employed, they'll be taken off the objectified swindle after a certain time of incubation. The emerging markets in Asia, Latin America, and East Europe was just a first foretaste. It isn't of time until the financial markets of the capitalist centers in the US, the EU, European, and Japan collapse. These are completely distorted by the elitish awareness of the labor society, including traditional left-wing and right-wing critics of capitalism. Fixatantum, which will to be the trans-historical and positive precondition of human existence, they systematically confuse cause and effect. The speculation of financial markets, which is cause for the temporary deferment of crisis, is then the other way around. Detected cause of the crisis. The evils, they say more or less panic-stricken, will ruin the absolutely wonderful labor society by gambling away good money of which they have more than enough just for kicks, in bravely investing it in marvelous jobs so that a labor maniac humanity may enjoy full employment self-indulgently. It is by no means speculation that brought investment in real economy to a standstill, but such investment became unprofitable as a result of the Third Industrial Revolution. The spin-off of share prices is just a symptom of the inner dynamics. Even capitalist logic, this money, circulating in ever-increasing loads, is not money any longer but rather hot air inflating the speculative bubble. Any bubble by means of whatsoever tax, tobint, etc., to divert flows to the ostensibly correct and real social treadmills will most probably bring about the sudden burst of the bubble. In that we all become inexorably unprofitable and therefore the criterion of profitability itself, to get the imminent foundations of labor society, should act as being obsolete, wages in demonising the speculators. Rightists, left-wing subversive elements, worth unionists, Kane nostalgics, sociologians, thieves, and all their apostles of honest labor unanimously cultivate such a cheap concept of an enemy. Very few of the fact that it is only a small step from such reasoning to the remobilization of the anti-Semitic paranoia. To empower of national-blooded non-monetary capital to fight the money-assing Jewish international monetary capital threatens to be the ultimate creed of the intellectually dissolute left, as it always been the creed of the racist, anti-Semitic, and American job creation scheme. Right.
And the direct form has ceased to be the great wellspring of wealth. Labor ceases and must cease to be its measure, as exchange value must cease to be the measure of use value. With that, product based on exchange value breaks down, and the direct, material production process is stripped of the form of penury and antithesis. Karl Marx, Foundation of the Critique of Political Economy, 857/8.
Labor key defined. After domestication, the human being cannot even imagine a life without labor. As a labor dominates the sphere of the economy in the narrow sense, but pervades social existence as a whole, creeping in day life and deep under the skin of everybody. Free a term in its literal meaning, is to consume commodities in order to increase future sales. Realized duty of commodity consumption as an end in itself and even outside offices and factories, lays its shadow on the modern individual. As soon as rises from the TV chair and becomes active, every is transformed into an act similar to labor. That's the time clock by the stopwatch, that celebrates its postmodern rebirth in chrome-plated gyms, and hollymakers burn up the kilometers as if they had to emulate the year's work of a long-distance lorry driver. Even sources orientated towards the standards of sexology and talk show boasting. Quite aware of meeting his doom when anything he touched turned into gold. His fellow sufferers, however, are beyond this stage. Work, labor, implies any longer that the particular sensual quality of any activity fades away and becomes insignificant when adjusted to the patterns of labor. On the contrary, contemporaries quite generally only ascribe meaning and social significance to an activity if they can square it with the indifference of the world of commodities. His don't know what to make of a feeling like grief, transformation of grief into grieving work, however, emotional alien element a known quantity one is able to gossip about with people of one's own kind. This way into dreaming work, To oneself with a beloved one turns into relationship work, and care for an into child-raising work past caring. Whenever a being insists on the seriousness of his activities, to the idle by using the word work, labor. The impera then is reflected not only in colloquial language. We are accustomed to using the term work/labor inflationary, but mix up two essentially different meanings of the word. Labor, no, as it would be, stands capitalist form of activity carried out in the end in itself treadmills, but synonym for any goal-directed human effort in general, thereby up its historical tracks. This lack of clarity paves the way for the widespread common-sense critique of labor society, which argues the wrong way around by affirming the imperialism of labor in a positivist way. As not control life through and through, the labor society is accused of conceptualizing labor too narrowly by only validating marketable gainful employment as true labor in disregard of morally decent do-it-yourself work or unpaid self-help, housework, neighbor help, etc. An upending of the concept labor shall eliminate the one-sided fixation along with the hierarchy involved. Not at all aimed at emancipation from the prevailing compulsions, but as semantic patchwork. The apparent labor society shall be resolved by manipulation of social awareness in elevating services, which are intrinsic to the capitalist sphere of production and deemed to be inferior so far to the noble of true labor. Yet the end of these services is not merely the result of a certain ideological view, but an inherent fabric of the commodity-producing system and cannot be abolished by means of a nice moral redefinition. What can real wealth has be expressed in monetary form in a society ruled by commodity production as an end in itself? The labor determined by this structure imperialistically rubs off onto any other sphere, although a negative way in making clear that basically everything is subjected to its rule. Intrinsic to commodity production necessarily remain well within the shadow of the capitalist production sphere because they don't square with economic administrative time logic even if and strictly when their function is vital, as it is the case with respect to female labor in the spheres of sweet home, lover, etc. A mourning of the labor concept instead of radical criticism not only veils social imperialism of the commodity-producing economy, but extremely well with the authoritarian crisis management. The cognition of housework and other menial services carried out in the so-called three-road sector, raised the 1970s of the last century, was on social benefits at the beginning. The crisis, however, has a table and mobilizes the moral impetus of such a claim straight against financial hopes in making use of the infamous subsidiarity principle. Singing honorary posts and honorary citizen activity does not mean that citizens may poke about in the nearly empty public coffers. Rather, it is cover up the state's retreat from the field of social services, to kill the forced labor schemes that are already underway, and to mean attempt to shift the burden of crisis onto women. The public retire from social commitment, appealingly and free of charge to all of us from now on to take private initiative in fighting one's very own or others' misery and never demand financial aid. Mission juggle with the still sacred concept of labor, widely understood as an emancipatory approach. Clears through the abolition of wages by retention of labor on the scorched earth of the market economy. The public institutions bear out that today social emancipation cannot be achieved by means of a redefinition of labor, but only conscious devaluation of the very concept.
Material prosperity, ordinary person-related services would increase immaterial prosperity. The welcomer will improve if the service provider relieves him of cumbersome chores. At the same being of the service provider will improve because the service rendered is likely to strengthen his self-esteem. The rendered personal service is better for the psyche of the service provider than the situation of being jobless. Report on Future Social Questions of the Free States of Bavaria and Saxony, 997. Proper hast no other knowledge but what thou hast got by working, the rest et all a hypothesis. Tom Lyle, Work Not Despairing, 1883.
Chapter 18. The opposing interests. However, the crisis of labor is repressed and made a taboo, its influence on social conflict is undeniable. The transition that was able to integrate the masses to a system of selection and apartheid, though, did not lead to a new round of the old class struggle between capital and labor. Rather, categorical crisis of the opposing interests as inherent in the system as such. Even of prosperity after World War II, the old basis of class struggle was on the wane. The route that the preordained revolutionary subject, working class, had been raided into society by means of manipulative wheelings and dealings and the bribes of a questionable prosperity. On the contrary, the emphasized because the logical identity of capital and labor as functional categories of a common social fetish form became evident on the stage of social development reached in the times of Fordism. The commodity labor power as immanent system, to any transcendental perspective. Up to last century, the working class struggled for the participation of ever larger sections of the population in the venomous fruits of the labor society. Under conditions of the Third Industrial Revolution, however, even this lost momentum. Only as our society expanded, was it able to stage the battle of opposing interests on a large scale. When the nation falls into ruins, it becomes more or less impossible to pursue the interests as inherent in the system by means of joint action. Becomes a general phenomenon. Wage trade unions, executives, desert employers associations, everyone for himself, and the capitalist system God against everybody. In turn, so invoked, is another symptom of the crisis of labor society. It is on an economic scale that interests may still be able to combine. It is somewhat of a privilege to organize one's very own life in accordance with the principles of business administration, which, by the way, makes of the idea of social emancipation, the representation of the interests of the commodity labor power degenerated into tough lobbyism of ever smaller sections of the society. Who accept the logic of labor has to accept the logic of apartheid as well. The very focus on ensuring that their ever smaller and very particular membership is able to sell its skin at the cost of the members of other unions. Stewards no longer fight the executive management of their own company, but the weight of competing enterprises and industrial locations, no matter the rivals are based in the nearest neighborhood or in the Far East. Should the quo is going to get the kick when the next internal campaign comes due, the colleague door turn into foes. The desolidarity is not restricted to the internal conflicts in companies or the rivalry between various trade unions. As all categories of the labor society in crisis fanatically insist on the logic immanent in the system, that is, the well-being of humans has to be a mere byproduct or side effect of capital valorization, basically any conflict is governed by the St. Florian principle. German prayer, St. Florian, please stay home. In set on fire the homes in my neighborhood. Is the patron saint of fire protection. All laws and play the game. Any penny compliance of a competing faction is a loss. Any security payments to the detriment of others may improve one's own prospect of a further period of grace. Thus, pensioner becomes the natural adversary of all social security contributors. The person turns into the enemy of health insurance policy. LD, and the hate native citizens is unleashed on immigrants. This views opposing interests inherent in the system as a leverage for social emancipation is irreversibly exhausted. The tradition finally reached a dead end. A real critique of capitalism depends on the categorical break with labor. Only if social emancipation is set beyond labor and its derivatives, value, commodity, money, state, law as a form, nation, democracy, etc., a level of solidarity becomes possible for society as a whole. real logic of lobbyism and individualization then could point beyond the present social formation, but only prevailing categories are referred to in a non-positivist way. Until now, the left's the categorical break with labor society. Strains are played down to be mere ideology. The logic crisis is considered to be due to a political project of the ruling class. The break is replaced by social democratic and Keynesian nostalgia. The left desires a new concrete universality beyond abstract labor and money form, but Frey holds on to the old form of abstract universality which they deem to be the one and only basis for the battle of opposing interests as intrinsic to the system. However, these remain abstract and cannot integrate any social mass movement simply because the left dodges dealing with the preconditions and causes of the crisis of the labor society. This is true of the call for a guaranteed citizens' income. Combining concrete social action and resistance against certain measures of the apartheid regime with a general program against labor, this demand produces a false universality of social critique, which is abstract, intrude the system, and help every respect. The mode of cutthroat competition described above cannot be neutralized that way. The full labor treadmill to the end of time is ignorantly presupposed. Where should need to finance a state-guaranteed income come from, if not smooth running of the valorization machine? Whoever pays social dividend, even this speaks volumes, has on it to bank on a winner position of his own country in the global free market economy. A free market world war may be able to afford the feeding of millions of capitalistically superfluous and penniless boarders for a short area. Further goes without saying that the holders of foreign passports are then naturally excluded. The do-it of reformism is ignorant of the capitalist constitution of the money form in every respect. In it becomes apparent that both the labor subject and the commodity consuming subject are doomed to perish. They only want to rescue the latter one. Instead question the capitalist way of life as such. They wish by crisis, the world be buried under a vast column of fuming cars, ugly piles, and commodities. There's that people may still be able to enjoy the one and only miserable freedom modern humans can conceive of, the free choice in front of supermarket shelves. Yet reduced perspective is completely illusionary. Its agonists and theoretical illiterates have long forgotten that capitalist commodity consumption has never been about the satisfaction of needs, but has always been nothing but a function and mere byproduct of the valorization process. When labor cannot be sold any longer, even its needs are regarded as outraged luxury claims, which be lowered to a minimum. That's why under the stances of crisis, a income scheme will suggest itself as a solution. As a reduction of government spending, it become the cheap version of social benefits, replace collapsing social insurance system. It was Friedman, the neoliberalism, who redesigned the concept of a citizen's income just for the reduction of public expenditure. Descartes takes up this concept as if it is a lifeline. How income will become reality only as pittance ever be
that the inevitable laws of our nature some human beings must suffer from want. These are the persons who, in the lottery of life, have blank Tothas, and on the principle of population, 1798.
The abolition of labor. The kick with labor will not find any existing, objectively determinable social camp, as it was in respect to traditional social action as inherent in the system. It is false and misleading laws and the common sense thinking of a second nature, and no means the only repeated and quasi-automatic execution of the latter. In that, the requires a negating consciousness, refuse rebellion without being able to rely on the backing of whatsoever law of history. No universal principle can provide the point of departure, the repulsion of one's very own existence a subject of labor and competition and the flat refuse of a life to rule on an ever more miserable level. Permanence, Lays never succeeded in completely wiping out the disgust at the constraints brought about by this form of social mediation. Apart from regressive fundamentalism, the complex at the heart of social Darwinism in particular, for protest and resistance does still exist. Anxiousness is widespread, but was socio-psychic subconscious and thereby silenced. For this, it is necessary to clear space for intellectual and mental freedom to enable the thinking of the unthinkable. World monopoly of interpretation must be contested. Theory of labor can serve as a catalyst. It theory to fiercely attack the ban on thinking and to say loudly and clearly what nobody dares to think, but many sense, the society is nearing its end. And there is reason to deplore its demise. Only an formulated critique of labor along with a corresponding theoretical debate could bring about a new public awareness, the indispensable prerequisite for the constitution of a social movement that puts labor critique into practice. The controversies of the labor camp are exhausted and become more and more absurd. That is why need for a redetermination of social conflict lines along which a social movement against labor can form up. It describes in broad outline what are the possible goals for a world beyond labor. Not a canon of positivist principles that feeds the program against labor, rather power of negation. Enforcement of labor, the means and social relations constituting life were alienated from humans. The negation society is only possible if humans reappropriate their capacity of social existence as social beings on an even higher historical level. The opponents strive for the constitution of global associations of free individuals who are ready to wrest the means of production and existence from the labor idol's hand and its idle-running valorization machine in order to take charge of social reproduction themselves. Only against the monopolization of all social resources and potentials for material wealth withheld by the powers of alienation as objectified in market and state, social realms of emancipation be conquered. Private property must be attacked in a different way. For left, private property was not the legal form intrinsic to the commodity-producing system, but merely an subjective capitalist control over resources. That gave the idea that private property could be overcome in terms of the category of the system itself. Property, nation, seemed to counter model of private property. The state, however, is not the outer cloak of forced community or, in words, the apt generality of the socially atomized commodity producers. Hence, form which itself is derived from private property, no matter whether garnished with the adjective socialist or not. In the society, both private property and state property become obsolete because any of them require a smoothly running valorization process. That intangible assets increasingly turn into dead assets. Industrial institutions jealously guard them and put them under lock and key to make sure that the means of production decay rather than be made available for other purposes. A take of production by associations of free individuals against the resistance of the state, its legal institutions, and the restraints exerted by them, is that these means of production will no longer be mobilized in the form of commodity production for the anonymous markets. Competition then will be replaced by open debate, mutual agreement, and decision of all members of society on how resources can be used wisely. It will establish the institutional identity of producers and consumers, of and unthinkable under the dictate of the capitalist end in itself. Market, once alienated from human society, will be by a graded system of councils, found district level to the global level, where associations of free individuals will decide about the flow of resources in letting prevail sensual, social, and ecological reason. Labor and occupation as an end in itself govern life, but the realization of the wise use of common species capacity will no longer be subjected to the control of the automatic invisible hand, but will social action. The material will be appropriated according to needs and not according to insolvency. The abstract universality of money and state will dissolve as well. A society with no need for borders will take the place of the separated nations, a world where everybody can move freely and will be able to avail himself of universal hospitality. Critique does not mean to coexist peacefully with the systemic constraints and take refuge to some social niche resort, but is it a declaration of war on the prevailing order? The slogan emancipation only can be, let's take we need. We know under the yoke of labor, we will be down on our knees before the democratic Krisis administration. The basis is that the new forms of social organization, free associations, are in control of all the material and social means of social reproduction. In that, our differs fundamentally from the limited goals of the narrow-minded lobbyists of an allotment garden socialism. The root about a split in human personality and mind. Its economic subject from the citizen, the work from the party animal, public life from abstract private life, social constituted maleness from socially constituted femaleness, confronts the isolated individuals with their very own social species capacities and social commonality as an extrinsic foreign power dominating them. The striving to overcome this schizophrenia by means of a concrete reappropriation of the social context through conscious and self-reflecting human action.
Labor, by its nature, is unfree, unhuman, unsocial activity, determined by private property and creating private property. Of private property will become a reality only when it is conceived as the abolition of labor. Karl Marx, of an article on Friedrich List's book, Das Nationale System der politischen Ökonomie, 845.
Chapter 19. A abolishment of labor directed against the enthusiasts of labor. The labor will certainly be accused of being nothing but dreamers. History society that is not based on the principles of labor, repression, fit competition, and some cannot work, they will say. Do opposites of the prevailing order really claim that the capitalist commodity production has brought about at least a passable life for the majority of the global population? Do smooth working if, due to the growth of the productive forces, billions are ostracized and can consider themselves lucky when they can survive on waste dumps. Millions of other people who can only endure their harassed life under the rule of labor in isolating themselves and numbing their minds by exposing themselves to a constant stream of dreary entertainment and fall mentally and physically sick in the end. What the world is made a desert currently just to breed more money out of money. Well, that's your our vestum works. To be with you, we don't want to cover ourselves with the glory of such exploits. It's on your ignorance and the weakness of your memory. In just your present and future crimes, you rely on the disastrous state of the world as brought about by your earlier crimes. And actually you suppressed all memory of it, that the state was obliged to commit mass murder to drum your false law of nature into people until it became their second nature to consider it a privilege to be employed under the orders of the system idol who drains their life energy for the absurd end in itself. It was to eradicate all the institutions of social self-organization and self-determination constituting the old agrarian societies before mankind was ripe to internalize the rule of labor and selfishness. Job. We are mystic. We Pavlov's dogs can escape from their conditioned existence. It whether the decline of labor will lead to a cure of labor mania or to the end of civilization. You will argue private property and abolishing the social constraint of earning money will result in inactivity and that laziness will spread. So that your entire natural system is based on nothing but coercive force. In why you dread laziness as a mortal sin committed against the spirit of the labor idol. Frankly, the of labor are not against laziness. We were ready to the restoration of a culture of leisure, which was a hallmark of any society but was exterminated to enforce restless production divested of any sense and meaning. Tenants of labor will lose no time in shutting down all those branches of production which only exist to let keep running the maniac and in itself machinery of the commodity-producing system, regardless of consequences. And that we are only talking about the car industry, defense industry, and new industry, the industries, which are obviously a public danger. We all such number of mental crutches and silly fancy goods designed to create the illusion of a full life. Further, the patients will disappear that only came into being because the masses of products had and have to be forced through the bottleneck of money form and market relations. Or do you still in need of accountants, controllers, marketing salesmen, advertising copywriters if things are produced according to needs and everybody can take what he or she wants? Why should officers and police forces, welfare workers and poverty administrators when there is no private property to protect, no poverty to administer, and nobody's to be drilled in obeying alienated systemic constraints? We can all cry, what of these jobs? That's you are well out what part of its lifetime humanity squanders every single day in accumulating dead labor, in killing people, and facing the systemic machinery. Entire cram full of volumes describing the grotesque, repetitive, and destructive properties of things produced by the end in itself social machinery. If we would, we could bask in the sun for hours. However, that all activity will cease if the coercion exerted by labor were to disappear. It is human activity, though, that will change as soon as it is no longer subject to a sphere of abstract, new time flow, divesting meaning and a mere end in itself, but which carried out in accord with an individual and variable time scale fitting with one's own way of life. The large-scale production when people will be able to decide themselves how to organize and sequences of operation without being subjected to the compulsions of valorization. Why should impertinent impositions forced upon us by means of the law of competition to haunt us? It is now discover slowness and tranquility. What housekeeping and the care for people who became invisible under the conditions of the labor society, based all those activities that were separated from political economy and stamped female. Neither the delicious meal, nor can be automated. Abolition of labor, the gender segregation will dissolve. These all activities can be brought to the light of a conscious social on gender stereotypes. The repressed chores will dissolve as soon as people are no longer subsumed under what essentially constitutes their life. Men as then can do those things according to the circumstances and the actual needs. Not that every activity will turn into pure pleasure. Some of them not. It goes there will always be necessities. But who will if it doesn't consume one's life? There will be can be done of one's own accord. Much a need as leisure. Even capable of wiping out this need, but it for its own ends. Thereby sit dry like a vampire. The opponent neither fanatics of blind activism nor do they champion passive loafing. Leisure necessities and voluntary activities are to be balanced wisely, taking account actual needs and the individual circumstances of life. As soon as forces are freed from the capitalist constraints of labor, time for the individual will increase. Long hours in assembly shops or offices when machines of all kind can do such work. Why human bodies get into a sweat when only a few harvesters can achieve the same result? Why should intellect with dull routine when computers can easily accomplish the objects? Only if technology can be adopted in its capitalist form, though. The bulk of it will have to be reshaped because they were constructed in accordance with the narrow-minded criterions of abstract profitability. On the end, for the reason, methodological conceptions were debarred from realization. Energy can be produced just round the corner. Labor banks on centralized large-scale power stations at the hazard of human life. Eco-friendly methods of cultivation are well known long since, but tracked profit calculation pours thousands of toxic substances into the water, ruins the soil, and air. For administrative reasons, constrained components and groceries are sent round the globe, although most things could be produced locally and could be delivered by short-distance freight traffic. For the most part, technology is just as absurd and superfluous as the entailed expenditure of utilized in the industrial process. We anything new. Use things very well. You never draw the logical consequences and will act accordingly. You decide consciously how to make use of the means of production, transportation, and communicate wisely, and which options should be discarded because they are destructive or simply unnecessary. The more off your mantra of freedom and democracy, more grimly you refuse any social freedom of choice in respect of even essential matters because of your desire to keep on obeying the ruling corpse of labor and its pseudo-laws of nature.
But not mere in present conditions, but insofar as its purpose in general is the mere increase of wealth, that labor itself, I say, harmful and pernicious, follows from the political economist's line of argument, without his aware of it. Karl Marx, Epic Philosophical Manuscripts, 1844.
Chapter 18. This labor is anti-politics. The labor is anything else but obscure utopia. In form, global city cannot survive for more than 50 or 100 years. The opponents of labor have to deal with the clinically dead labor idol does not necessarily make their task any easier. The more the labor society is worsening and reformist attempts of repair work fail, the more gap is widening between the isolated and helpless monads as constituted by capitalist city and the potential formation of a movement that is ready to reappropriate the socially constituted species' capacities. The rapid social relations all over the world proves that the old ideas and sentiments on labor and competition are unshaken, but are read ever lower standards. Stabilization seems to be the natural course of the crisis despite widespread discontent and unease. Aspect of these bleak prospects, it would be to refrain from criticizing labor practically by means of a comprehensive socially all-embracing program and to confine oneself to the scraping of a bare living in the ruins of labor society. Criticism will only stand a chance if it swims against the tide of desocialization instead of being carried away by it. The stabilization, however, cannot be done by means of democratic politics, but only by against it. Those who anticipatory reappropriation and transformation of the entire social fabric can hardly ignore the authority that has so far organized the general conditions. To rebel against the expropriation of the social general capacities without heading for confrontation with the state. The state custodian of about 50% of the national social wealth, but guarantees that all social capacities are compulsorily subject to the dictates of valorization. The opponents of labor cannot ignore state and politics. True that the opponents of labor cannot succeed in being supportive of the state. If implies the end of politics, a political for the abolition of labor is a contradiction in terms. Labor make demands on the state, do not form a political party and will never do so. The politics is to seize power, become the administration, and carry on with labor society. That's of labor don't want to take the control centers of power, but switch them off. Our politics, states of the modern age and the coercive system of labor are inseparably intertwined and have to disappear side by side. The renaissance of politics is just an attempt to haul back the critique of economic terror to the right road of positivist civil action. Self and self-determination, however, is the exact opposite of state and politics. Economic and cultural freedom is not feasible in a political roundabout way, through channels, or other tracks of this sort, but in conquering a counter-society. Free to be the human raw material of the markets, nor does to be the dressage horse of state administration. Freedom beings organize their social relations on their own without the intervention and mediation of an alienated apparatus. According to it, the opponents of labor want to create new forms of social movement and want to occupy bridgeheads for a reproduction of life beyond labor. In of combining a counter-social practice with the offensive refusal of labor. Mentors call us fools because we risk the break with their irrational compulsory system. We use but the prospect of a catastrophe that humanity is currently heading for with the executives of the prevailing order at the helm. We can win labor. Workers, call it a day.